The real shift that has to happen on the African continent is the amount of money being invested. So we're still seeing, sadly, minuscule amounts of capital being deployed on the continent in comparison with other continents. Africa is ranking last in the venture capital stakes. I think last year, Latin America received about $15 billion of venture capital across the South American continent, and Africa received just over $1 billion. So we are by far the least invested continent on the planet, and in comparison with the United States, which leads that ranking board, those numbers are around $230 billion being invested annually and growing in the US to early stage startups across the board.
But we have seen foreign investment and the thinking behind foreign investment, especially on the continent, changing quite a bit in 2025. How does that affect the venture space and a lot of the startups, that you are investing in yourself?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that it is hard to raise money on the continent. It generally takes an African entrepreneur a lot longer to raise money than their counterpart in the United States, which of course slows growth because it takes capital to grow a business, and particularly through the early stages of unprofitability and getting to that magic formula of being a profitable business. And the lack of capital can really slow that down. So what we need to see is the increase of speed at which deals are being done on the continent, and what we need to see is the increase in capital that's being deployed. And those two things could really, really help shift and shape what the African startup scene and the entrepreneurial world looks like on the continent. Of course, for the last 5 years, we've seen huge disruption, first from a pandemic and then global supply chains and then global inflation. And we're still seeing a very, very turbulent economic time. But from that perspective, I think Africa remains a constant. Not a lot has changed economically here over the last 5 years, whilst we've been seeing huge disturbance economically, globally. So in my mind, Africa is a very relatively stable bet, and that makes her an interesting investment from my perspective.
What's your expectation then for 2025?
2025, I think the verdict is still open at the moment. Obviously, we've got very interesting economic times globally. We thought we were going to move into a period of stability now after inflation had been decreasing around the world. But obviously, the economic volatility of the United States is again throwing some uncertainty in that mix. And by far the largest donor funds coming into Africa has been historically coming from the United States. So I think the verdict is out.